Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Florida Pulse. I'm engagement editor John A. Torres for Florida Today newspaper here in Brevard County. Today, we'll be talking about the new school year, lessons learned last year, I just lost my lights, and new challenges facing educators, parents, and students for the new school year as debates continue throughout the state regarding masks and vaccinations. I'm pleased to welcome our expert panelists. We have three excellent panelists here tonight. Thank you, Rob. Crack producer Rob Landers, who also does lights. We are joined by Emily Bloch, Florida Times Union education reporter. Chris CURRAN, an associate professor and director of the University of Florida's Education Policy Research Center. And Christine Moore, assistant superintendent for student services right here at Brevard Public Schools on the Space Coast. Lastly, my co-host is Nathan CRABBE, opinion and engagement editor for the Gainesville Sun, and I'm going to let him ask the first question.
Thank you, John, and thanks to our guests for being here today. You know, it's been a tumultuous start to the school year. I mean, the start of the school year is always anxiety-inducing for parents and students alike, but this one has been especially so. You know, here in Alachua County, we've had dozens of school employees who are in quarantine to begin the year. We're one of the districts, one of a handful of districts that's put a mandatory mask policy in place, which has got a hostile response from the governor, to say the least. Emily, let's start off with you. What's kind of the lay of the land here in Florida in terms of how the surge in cases because of the Delta variant is affecting school personnel and how are schools responding with mask policies and other precautions?
Sure. So one thing I think is important to emphasize is that depending on where you live, this is going to look different. So the way one school district is handling COVID-19 protocol in North Florida might look different than in South Florida and so on. And it really varies. But things that we do know across the board are that, for one, mask mandates are not universal the way they were last year or as much last year. This year, there's a lot, it's a lot more tumultuous. A district order or an emergency order, an executive order, excuse me, said that masks could not be mandated universally across the board, even though we know that the CDC has been recommending that. So to cope with that, some school districts have put in a requirement, but with an opt-out. Some school districts are suggesting that masks are worn. Some aren't doing that at all, leaving it completely optional. And some are defying the orders and saying, we want to mandate strong bold, period. And then other things we're seeing different are how schools are approaching virtual school this year. So last year, funding would transfer over if a school district wanted to imply some sort of hybrid virtual model. And this year, a lot of that funding has been taken away. So it isn't as easy to have a student still keep their magnet seat or stay enrolled at one school while also attending part-time or virtually. If they want to be a virtual student or their parent or family wants them to be virtually enrolled, they're going to have to do that full-time. So then there are a lot of decisions that obviously come with that when it comes to magnet students, when it comes to non-homeschool and things of that nature.
So what is happening in Duval now in terms of the opt-out policy there? I mean, how many students are opting out of wearing masks?
So in Duval County, right, there's an opt-out policy. Last week, the school board voted to require masks unless parents wanted to opt out through some paperwork. And in Duval County, it's about 5% have opted out, which translates to, I believe it's almost 7,000 students in total out of 128,000-ish students. But I will add one caveat there is that the way those numbers are dispersed might not necessarily be even. What I'm hearing from teachers is that one of their classes might have 5 students that have opted out of math, while another classroom might have none. So there's not really, it's not dispersed evenly right now.
I'd like to jump in here, Nathan, if it's okay, and ask Christine Moore something. I've gotten a few parents reach out to us here at the paper asking about protocols and how prepared the school district is. In other words, if there's a student who tests positive and the class has to quarantine, what happens? Do they go to online learning for a few weeks? Is homework just assigned for a few weeks and they go home? As well as, are there protocols in place for teacher absences and shortage of school bus drivers and substitute teachers, et cetera?
Sure. Well, there are many protocols. We started off the year understanding exactly how we were going to handle cases, contact cases in school, contact cases in the community, how those students were going to be quarantined, what the days were, and you may or may not be aware, but the Florida Department of Health put a new rule into place on Friday, which kind of changed the number of days and how we were quarantining and how we were returning students to school. So we have stepped back, we've punted, we've redone our protocols, we've trained our principals, and those protocols are online. They're going to be updated just slightly and be back online on Monday. I'm getting a lot of feedback, so I hope I'm coming through clear.
Yeah, no, you are. That's great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the work, the plan is that students are going to have access to in secondary school, they have access to all their online platforms. Most of our teachers in the secondary setting do post their work for students to be able to access and work throughout the quarantines. Elementary schools are going to be working on sending home packets of information, making contact with the students as they're able, trying to reach out and offer help. Our students who receive special services, we're looking at ways to continue to engage them, continue to work throughout the quarantine with them, and or pick up those services as soon as they get back to ensure they stay up to place. Lots of challenges there. We're working through them. It's week one. We're going to work through them. We're going to get them right because like Emily said, last year we had an online platform that we were allowed to use. This year we don't. In that way, we still have our virtual program. I think probably the most important significant question, John, is when our teachers start getting quarantined, and at what point it becomes difficult to keep operating a building. And so, I'll just tell you, as we are getting through this week, we have already started pushing supports out to schools. As schools call us and say, or as we notice that things might be becoming difficult, we've been using a lot of district level resources to push into buildings to keep those buildings up and running. Our goal is to keep kids in school. Our goal is to keep kids safe and learning. So that's we're gonna do what we need to do to keep that going.
Great, thank you.
So, Chris, the academic impact of the pandemic has been pretty huge. I saw there was a story in the New York Times a few days ago that it was that 1 million students, weren't enrolled in local schools across the country during the heat of the pandemic last year, and a lot of those students are low-income students. A lot of them are young students, kindergartners. What has the academic impact been, and how are schools kind of coping with how to address the learning losses for kids that have missed school or faced disruptions or not really had a great experience on online learning?
It's a great question, Nathan. So we have seen from the New York Times analysis that in some school districts, upwards of 20% or more of kindergartners were not enrolled last year. That either could be the case where kindergartners were foregoing that year, waiting a year to enroll, what we sometimes refer to as redshirting, or it may be the case that they're engaged in other forms of learning, whether that's homeschooling, some form of virtual charter school or otherwise, and they're going to be showing back up next year within the first grade classroom. But I think a big question is how, as you just asked, how do we address the potential negative impacts that there's been on academic learning? So even from very early in the pandemic, there were estimates in the academic literature that suggested that the pandemic and the disruptions caused by it would have real implications for children's academic outcomes. And we knew that based on research from natural disasters, missed days from weather events like snow days, as well as the literature on things like school discipline and other mechanisms that keep kids out of the classroom. And I think, in fact, we've seen that here in Florida. The FSA scores were released a few weeks ago, and in fact, there were rather sizable drops across a number of subjects, particularly mathematics. And in some cases, increases in some of the achievement gaps by race and ethnicity, though that was not seen in necessarily all of the subject areas. And so I think schools now are really trying to grapple with and think about how they can make up for that. Unfortunately, they have some additional resources from the federal government through the CARES Act to be able to address that. Many of them have already been proactively taking steps through the summer with additional summer school hours, tutoring, other services to try to begin to make up some of that ground. I think what the academic literature right now is really trying to emphasize is the need, though, to focus less on the learning loss and think less about remediation, but actually try to shift this narrative to one of acceleration. So I was fortunate enough to contribute some thoughts to a living working document called the Acceleration Imperative that was put together by the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And it really brings together a lot of ideas from the academic literature about how we begin to push students and accelerate them. So rather than thinking about what they've lost over the last year, we try to focus on an emphasis on having high quality, grade level materials and curriculum and instruction that can allow students to not just make up for what they've lost, but actually begin to accelerate and really close those gaps and then actually make additional gains this year. So I think the emphasis is if we want to catch people up, we have to run faster than we have before. We have to put in more work than we have to have before, and we have to actually accelerate rather than simply remediate.
We have two Chris's, so I know that Chris Moore was almost ready to answer that question. Was there anything that you wanted to add, Chris?
I couldn't. I agree with him entirely. So I have nothing to add.
I got you. Okay, great. Thank you. I wouldn't mind hearing from all three panelists on what I'd like to ask next is, as the father of a high school senior, girl, I know that last year was very stressful for, well, all of us, obviously, but children and students in particular who, who all of a sudden were just home, quarantined, learning, isolated, alone. Are there any long-term effects to that? And are there any things here locally, Christine Moore, that the school district is looking out for, warning signs or anything like that to try and identify problems and perhaps help?
So that's a really big question. I'm sorry, all of these are really big questions. So the first thing we have to recognize is that being in a pandemic means that at this point we really don't see an end. I'll be frank. It's not like a hurricane where we can prepare for it and then it comes and then it's over and we can all rebuild our lives. And so what our kids are living through is when is this going to be over moment? When do I get to regroup and repair and move on with my life? And it's not just our kids, but it's our adults. And it's probably one of the most stressful, traumatic events that our kids are going to go through. And for kids that are already bringing trauma to the classroom, this is just compounding that. So we have been working with our teachers on what a trauma-informed classroom looks like, what a trauma-informed school looks like. We've building in SEL programs. All of our teachers are being or have been trained in youth mental health first aid. So there's all kinds of pieces and parts to that. But probably unbeknownst to a lot of our public, Brevard Public Schools sits on lots of community mental health initiatives. And we work with our community around us and surrounding us. So whenever we're able to bring in experts, whenever we're able to bring in partnerships, we try to do so. And last year we were very fortunate. We were able to bring in many social workers into our buildings. We offered mental health services and mental health referrals in our buildings, and we're able to serve. I want to say we initiated and were able to complete 85% of the mental health referrals that we initiated. So there's a lot going on, and it's at every level. But I will tell you that as long as our kids don't see an end, don't see an opportunity to stop and regroup and move on, it's going to continue to be it's just going to continue to compound the other things that go with being a teenager, right?
Yeah. Would anyone
like
to add to that?
Sure, I can add to that quickly. So a few things. So number one, in Northeast Florida, recently a group of doctors held a webinar about COVID-19 questions that parents might have. And their end goal was to implore the school district to mandate masks, because one of the talking points they said across the board, and these were physicians, pediatricians, entomologists, or not entomologists, I'm sorry, epidemiologists, etc. And they all said that yes, wearing a mask might not be comfortable all the time, but the benefit of being able to be in school wearing a mask outweighs the negative mental health implications that keeping kids out of school even longer could possibly have. Another thing I'll add that Duval County is doing, similar to Brevard, is trauma training for teachers. In addition, they've added a telehealth for students across the board, and I'm actually not sure if other school districts are doing this, but just like how employees can use telehealth sometimes, or a teledoc to have a doctor's appointment, Duval Schools is doing that for every student enrolled in its district, and it also includes psychotherapy, mental health therapy, and things of that nature. So that's something that Duval County is doing specifically.
And I think, John, just to add an anecdote, I think this affects kids at the full range of the spectrum. So I have a 3-year-old at home, and if you realize now, he spent about half his life in the midst of the pandemic. And so the normal things that you would do with young children to socialize them to their peers, to give them these early learning experiences, have been significantly curtailed and brought into balance with trying to maintain physical health and safety from the virus. And so I think we do need schools to be thinking about this and trying to take steps that both allow us to protect young children that are unvaccinated from the virus, but also ways to ensure that there are socio-emotional developmental opportunities to be in these social contexts. And one thing that's been reassuring to me, I was looking recently at some national data that's collected by the University of Washington's Center for Reinventing Public Education, and they've been tracking among 100 of the largest urban school districts in the country how some of the federal CARES Act funds have been used by school districts. And actually the second highest, I believe, category in which the funding is being used right now, or at least reported by these 100 districts, is for socio-emotional supports. It only comes in a near second to making up for lost instructional time, and is actually almost twice the rate of districts reporting the use of those funds for that than it is for things like curriculum and improvement. So my sense is school districts are very well attuned to this need and are trying to put some of those resources to address these kind of broader wraparound concerns that I think issues of social distancing and closure of our standard institutions and masking and so forth have unfortunately resulted in as a result of the pandemic and the COVID virus.
Gotcha. I am happy to hear about all of that funding, but it also makes me sad at the same time, I guess. So I'm going to swing it back to Nathan to see if he has anything right now.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the federal funding. I guess I wonder what my understanding is that there is a pot of American Rescue Plan money that we haven't even tapped as a state. And I guess, Christine, I guess I'm curious from you to learn a little bit more about what you're getting from the state, what you're waiting on from the state, kind of what the marching orders are in terms of steps that you should be taking in terms of protecting students' health and all this.
So I'm going to give you the answer that I know, not because I'm actually in charge of those funds, because I am probably not going to be the best spokesperson for it, but I'm going to tell you what I know for a fact and leave off anything I think I know. So we've gotten three different versions of ESSER. ESSER 1 was basically the state funding that came in last year and throughout the summer. The funding came in, the plan went out, it was spent, much of it, like you said, on academic recovery and mental health and social well-being initiatives, as well as stabilizing the district, because, as the biggest employer in the county, we had to make, we didn't have to, we wanted to make a commitment to keep all of our staff employed, receiving a paycheck, being able to continue to raise their families in Brevard County. So that was ESSER 1. ESSER 2, we have not received that funding yet. We have allocated it. We have the plan for it. The vast majority of it is, again, on academic recovery, which includes, the technology to support it. as well as, what my division does, which is student services, which is psychological support, social work support, mental health support, social emotional learning, all of those pieces. We have not received that money yet. I believe that that has to go to the state. My understanding is it goes to a legislative panel who's going to read it and review it and approve it or not approve it. So we're waiting for that approval and we're waiting for that funding. ESSER 3 is more federal funding. I will tell you, we all have a plan for it. We know how we will spend it, what we will spend it on. We haven't received any guidance on that. I'm not sure when that is coming out, when the guidance is coming out, or when that is due. But that's where we are with the ESSER funding.
Gotcha. Thank you, Christine. Emily, I wanted to ask you, as I said earlier, I am the dad of a high school senior, and she's not one to talk about proms or dances or anything like that. And her first words on the first day of school to me were, gee, I really hope we have a prom this year. Christine Moore said that she doesn't really see a light at the end of the tunnel for things to really ever go back to normal right now. But are you hearing or seeing the same thing from the students that you talk to about wanting a return to normalcy, sports, proms, mixers, whatever?
Oh gosh, yes. It's really hard, right? So this is the third senior class that is going to have to deal with this weird new normal during a pandemic, right? And so for the class of 2020, what I hear from students is that they missed out on prom. They missed out on a traditional graduation ceremony. They got all of this attention because they were the first senior class to go through it. They got, virtual proms held by national platforms, and the Obamas had that graduation ceremony virtually and all these things. By the time the class of 2021 was dealing with all of this, they told me that they felt like the redheaded stepchild, right? That they didn't get this huge pomp and circumstance because already another class before them had dealt with it, that they felt a little forgotten. And we already know that their homecoming dances typically didn't happen for the most part, or if they did, they were like severely modified. The same with proms. And the same with graduation ceremonies. Those mostly happen outdoors. And if you know what Florida is like in the summer for an outdoor ceremony, it's not super ideal. So it's already affected 2 senior classes. And now this third senior class is wondering, is this going to be me as well? And what we know, at least locally, is that and of course, across the board, school districts are trying to find a balance and to tiptoe this line and find a way to keep kids safe and still let them have these experiences. But we've also seen that fail in some aspects. So in Duval County, for instance, they canceled homecoming last year to keep kids safe. They had a homecoming game, but they did not have a homecoming dance. Well, students ended up having their own unofficial homecoming gatherings, parties, and there ended up being outbreaks on campus, and students had to be virtual and quarantined because of outbreaks from unofficial homecoming parties. Then for prom, Duval County Schools, for instance, announced that they were going to do outdoor proms on campus in schools' courtyards instead of typically they're at like a hotel, for instance, with the whole pomp and circumstance again. The interest was so low in these modified outdoor proms that those proms ended up getting canceled almost across the board. At least I think 8 high schools was my count by the end of it. So it's a lot of uncertainties right now. I asked our superintendent if they had any clue yet if homecoming was even on the table, and the answer I got is that it's too soon to tell, that those are decisions that typically happen at the end of a quarter, the end of a semester. But it's a lot of unknown, and it stinks.
Yeah, that must be tough. I mean, I guess more reason for everyone to get vaccinated and wear masks to make this pandemic is, this current surge as short-lived as possible. I guess the mask thing, though, is still an open debate, and a legal case is being heard tomorrow on that. Chris, I guess I wonder, these kind of decisions had traditionally been left up to local school districts in the past, and in fact, in Florida's Constitution kind of gives a lot of that power to local school districts. What's your sense of kind of how that kind of debate is playing out in terms of the state kind of making these decisions, and whether school districts have any leeway to mandate masks on their own?
It's a great question, Nathan, and certainly it's put, I think, politicians and others in a bit of a tension here. Right? We've seen politicians who traditionally would hold to local control and values of that, but there's now been debates between what localities want, particularly when it comes to masks, and the mandates from the state. Both here in Florida and other states are experiencing similar things. You know, I think a lot of the questions of the legality of this are going to be addressed by the courts, as they will in Florida, and as we've seen in other states where some of the courts have already overturned or at least provided kind of holds on executive orders from the state level to hold back on mask mandates. I think ultimately it's sort of an unfortunate thing that all of this has become so politicized. You know, I think at the end of the day, we've got people that hopefully all can agree on the fact that we want to do what's best for kids to ensure their safety and ensure their education and their social development. And I think the key here is to kind of think about ways to get past the politics of this and think about ways to compromise and work together in ways that can maximize all of those competing goals of public health and freedom and so forth.
Christine Moore, just to follow up on the mask a little bit, we've heard a lot from students and from ABAT students and parents. What are the teachers saying? I know that locally here in Brevard County, we saw this really moving post from a teacher who was fighting cancer, who asked her class if they would be willing to wear masks in the classroom for her. You know, what is that typical? Are the teachers wanting students to wear masks? How are they feeling about it?
So our teachers are a microcosm of the community around us, right? There are certainly teachers that would like to wear a mask and would like their students to wear masks. There are teachers who feel the exact opposite. To assume that our whole workforce feels the same way would just be erroneous, and I don't want to speak out of turn and lead you to believe otherwise. I think one of the things I'm most concerned about is the fracture of our community and the support for our schools over the issue. Our teachers, their job is to educate kids. That's what they wake up for. Our support staff who serve kids every day, they've chosen to work for Brevard Public Schools because they want to serve the children of Brevard. And the stress that the fracture of this issue has put on them takes away from our ability to focus on our priorities. It takes away from caring for the educational and social well-being of our kids. And so it stresses us in a totally different way than just, you know, are we going to wear a mask or are we not going to wear a mask? I certainly support the DOH and the DOH's recommendations on that. And I support our school board's debate and decision on that. But I think what's significant for me is the social well-being of our kids and our workforce, and our knowing that our community supports us as public educators and the work that we do for kids.
That's a great point, Christine. Brevard County, as I'm sure other counties around the state are, is extremely fractured right now, and it's become such a hot and contentious issue, all of that stuff. I just want to follow up with whoever wants to answer this, but here locally, we've heard some comments from some parents who don't want to participate in contact tracing if there's an exposure in the schools. Are you guys hearing about that or seeing that elsewhere as well? Maybe Emily first, or?
Sure. So I haven't specifically heard about parents opting out of contact tracing yet. It might be happening. It's just not something I've heard directly yet. But I have heard a lot of confusion just because that does continue to be something that district to district is being handled a little differently. So for instance, even how that information is transmitted is handled differently. In Duval School, they have an online dashboard, and the Department of Health is doing contact tracing, but the school district is getting ahead of it. And if contact tracing is launched, they already count that case on the dashboard so that families are aware. Other school districts aren't doing it in that order. Some school districts aren't posting that information at all. And so there's a lot of confusion, and it really just kind of varies, but I haven't heard the specific parent opt out yet.
And I can address it for Brevard County. So there really is no opting out of contact tracing if the case or the contact case is if the school is notified about those cases. So the Department of Health works with us every day. They notify us of cases as they arise. They notify us as for contacts of cases, as well as our community does call them in. Our parents do call them in. Whenever there is a call called in, our admin team, whether it's the principal themselves or their designee, does a full contact trace of the school, the class, the lunch, the playground, the bus, the after-school activities. They do a full contact trace, and they send in the numbers of students impacted by that, and then those students are quarantined according to our DOH guidelines. What we are seeing an opt-out of is testing. So when students go home sick, we are seeing some parents say, well, I'm not going to test my child because if my child tests positive, then you are going to contact trace, or then you are going to make, my other children stay home. So the contact tracing in the building, you can't opt out of. We're responsible for that, and we're doing it. But how parents individually in their home handle sick kids, we are seeing some impact of that on our schools.
All right, great. Well, I think we are going to start wrapping it up. Why don't we give each of our panelists an opportunity to either bring up something that we haven't asked yet, or just a final word or a comment? Let's begin with Chris CURRAN. You're on the hot seat.
Thanks, John. So this is a great conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to join with everyone and share some of the research and different perspectives that we've seen in these conversations. I think this is just going to continue to be such an evolving situation. Everything that we've even just seen over the past month. I think a month ago, all of us were anticipating a much more normal year as we sat sort of at the bottom of one of these curves of infection rates, and now we're in the midst of this spike that's come on very quickly. And I think we're seeing nationally school districts try to respond to that in a rapid way. So the proportion of districts that have planned for some virtual option has almost doubled over the last couple of weeks, according to some sources. And I think many districts are still trying to figure out and put in place plans for quarantines and other sorts of things. It's kind of interesting to me to note that here in Florida and some of other states in the South, we're a bit ahead of the curve in the sense of being opening of school districts earlier, right? We have earlier start times in the year than some of our counterparts in other parts of the country. And so I think there are some opportunities here to see what's working, to see what's not working, and to try to use those lessons to inform national conversations so that as schools over the next month across the country return to schooling, that we can try to maximize in-person learning, keep kids safe from COVID, and ensure the best and safe learning environment for everyone.
Emily or Christine, do you want to say a final word, or is there something that we didn't bring up that you want to address quickly?
The only thing I would like to say or to bring up is that, what makes the national media are the sensational stories. It's it's people arguing, it's people disagreeing, it's it's all the extremes. And there's a large group of people, and I mean a large group of people in the middle. It's 64,000 kids showing up to school every day. It's 7,000 employees bringing their best to work every day. It's the community around Brevard Public Schools that calls us up daily saying, how do we support you? How do we help you? So for me, the bigger story is the success of keeping kids in school and educating and keeping them well, and the parents that do support us, and our employees who bring their best every day. So the only thing I want to bring up is, there's a whole other story, and it's a story of hope, and it's a story of the privilege of working with kids. And so I don't want to ever lose sight of that, and I hope that our community doesn't ever lose sight of that.
I guess just to piggyback off Chris, what I'll say really is that yes, often in mainstream media, it's really easy to see an extreme of either side, a polar opposite of either side, because that's the loudest voices in the room. And I think the importance of local journalism, like what we're doing today, this panel discussion, and so much of the coverage that you see from across our state, is finding the nuance within those stories, finding, those softer spoken stories, highlighting the wins, and also spotlighting the losses and what's really happening in our community. So that's what we're trying to do. And I appreciate, again, this discussion. There's a lot of heroic stories and a lot of important numbers that have to be told during this pandemic, but also always. And that's what people like myself and of course other reporters on this panel and across try to do every day.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for joining Nathan and I on this panel, Florida Pulse. We thank you again for your time. We hope that our viewers were able to get something out of this. This was an incredibly interesting conversation, and I hope that they will join us for future Pulse episodes as they pop up. Just check with your local Gannett newspaper. On behalf of Nathan Crabbe and myself, I'm going to say good night and see you next time.
Good night.